Good morning. Our reading this morning comes from Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun. And behold, the tears of the oppressed. They had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors, there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead who are already dead more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. Then I saw that all toil and all skill and work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after the wind. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after wind. Again, I saw vanity under the sun. One person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, "For whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure?" This also is vanity and an unhappy business. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. For he went from prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. I saw all the living who move about under the sun, along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end of all the people, all of whom he led. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and a striving after wind. So as we've been reading through the book of Ecclesiastes, we have been confronted with futility at every turn. Solomon has been writing to us about how life in and of itself, right, not considering God, not considering anything else, just life in and of itself is completely futile. And most of that futility comes from death. Right, we've seen that all through the book. All of the things that you would want to put your trust in, they all amount to nothing because ultimately everyone dies. It's enough to get you really down. But don't worry. Today's text reminds us that not everything is all just death. Solomon reminds us that there's also oppression and greed and loneliness too. In today's text, Solomon focuses on how disordered our relations are to other people and to material wealth. And he starts just with the bare fact of oppression. I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun. And Solomon laments how some people keep other people down. And they have all the power on their side. And so nobody stops them. And the oppressed have nothing. All they can do is cry. And they have no one to comfort them. Right? The injustice is galling. Because nobody's getting what they deserve in this situation. Right? Those who are suffering should have someone to comfort them. Those who are oppressing them should have someone to punish them. They shouldn't have the power. And yet, he sees the way that things are. And the injustice is galling. And so who even needs to worry about death when life itself is this riddled with futility? In fact, Solomon says that this kind of futility that he has observed Right? The oppression that's done and how nobody comforts the oppressed, how the oppressors have the power. Solomon says that that is even worse than death. I thought the dead who are already dead, more fortunate than the living who are still alive. Better than both is he who has not yet been. All right, we get Solomon asks basically the same question here that It's a Wonderful Life asks. Right? Would it indeed have been better not to have been born? But Solomon moves on from there. Why are our relationships with other people so disordered? Right? What could motivate this kind of intolerable circumstance that we read about at the beginning of the chapter? We get, I think, a possible answer for that in verse 4. I saw that all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. In part, our disordered relationships because we have a disordered relationship with material wealth. Right? You can't relate properly to wealth. You're going to have a hard time relating properly to other people. And Solomon sees this disorder just in how much of human activity just boils down to envy, to jealousy. Right? People doing work that they really wouldn't bother to do for themselves, just of their own motives. The only reason they're doing it is because they see what somebody else has and they get jealous of it. And so we see these problems intertwined. People don't know how to treat each other right because of things like greed. And people don't know how to treat material wealth right because of jealousy. Right? The people problem and the wealth problem kind of go hand in hand. And so what's the answer to that? Is the answer then to just remove these things from the picture? Right? Solomon considers both of those answers, and he does so using classical wisdom. Right? The wisdom that we're used to hearing out of the book of Proverbs. And the answer that classical wisdom gives us is no. You can't just remove these things from the picture and get rid of the futility of life. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Right? Ceasing to care at all about material things is just as futile as caring too much about material things. Right? We're looking at two different extremes here. You've got the guy who's envious, and so he does all of this work just because he's jealous of what other people have. Then you've got this guy who does nothing. And they're both in bad straits. And then we read some more classical wisdom. Again, I saw vanity under the sun, one person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all his toil. And his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and an unhappy business. All right, this man who has nobody else in his life is also given over to futility. All right, so he cares about things, but he stopped caring about people, and he's never stopped to ask what's going to happen to all this stuff. So ceasing to care about other people, ceasing to care about material things, those also are not options. But it's at this point that Solomon really digs the knife in and starts to twist it on us. Because he begins to suggest a possible way out of things using classical wisdom. Again, this is the happy wisdom that we like to read out of the book of Proverbs, where things make sense and people get what they deserve. We start reading in verse 9, again, something that could have been lifted right out of the book of Proverbs. Two are better than one. because they have a good reward for their toil. All right, here we begin to see, right, what if in this life you do manage to have properly ordered relationships with other people and with material wealth? And Solomon's going to explore that a little bit with us. Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil. Again, we see both of those things working, the relationship with people and the relationship with material goods. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. All right, this sounds like a promising development in a book that up to this point has been extremely depressing and not full of hope. Solomon says, let's consider this even a little bit further. All right, you've got people getting together, relating to each other well. You got two people getting together, that's really good. Three people getting together, that's great. What if we expand this out some? What if we present the ideal case of our relationships with other people and with material wealth working as well as they can? And again, he frames this in terms of classical wisdom. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. All right, so this kid, he listens to wisdom. That's great. That's hopeful. He doesn't have some kind of inordinate relationship to wealth. He's poor. He's not acting greedy. He's not the fool who's folding his hands. But neither is he avaricious, envious, greedy. For he went from prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. There's a bright future ahead for this kid. The one who's listening to wisdom, the one who's not inordinately attached to wealth. He's going to become king. I saw all the living who move about under the sun, along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end to all the people, all of whom he led. Again, if two are better than one, and if a threefold cord is not quickly broken, what do we think about this? There's no end to all the people, all of whom this wise youth led. Here we have this man at the pinnacle. He's not envious. He's not oppressing anybody. Perfectly ordered relationships between this wise youth and all of these people around him, and with the wealth that surrounds him. And here's where Solomon twists the knife. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Now we've come around full circle. Solomon says, oh, you thought I was done talking about death? Did you forget about death? We're not done with death. Let's imagine this kid in the perfect scenario. Everything in his life is ordered the way it's supposed to be. He's still going to die, and people are going to forget about him. People who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and a striving after wind. And Solomon has been going through systematically and showing us that all of the things in this life that we would want to hang our hat on are dust. And so we proclaim, as we do every Lord's Day, the only thing that is certain, the only thing that is permanent, the only thing you can hang your hat on, the good news of Jesus Christ. We call everyone to believe in this good news that Jesus of Nazareth is the Son of God, God incarnate, God who came in the flesh, lived among us, and gave himself as a sacrifice for our sins. We call on everyone to turn away from sin. We call on everyone to confess Jesus is Lord and to be baptized into his death, burial, and resurrection for the remission of your sins. Because in Jesus, we have a promise over and against all of this despair that we've been reading about in the book of Ecclesiastes, where Solomon has shown that life in and of itself is meaningless and pointless and falls apart. God, through Jesus Christ, offers us permanent meaning and permanent hope. If you're subject to the invitation, won't you come as together we stand and sing?